Okay. Well, so first of all, I just wanted to say hello and thank you for all of you for joining us today. This is a three-part webinar presentation that we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. This is the first of the three, and it is CMMC 2.0, the new rules on how they're affecting you, from a timing, and what does this all mean as far as getting started. So with us today, we have several of our cybersecurity analysts on the line with us who are going to be offering up their expertise and some insight. And with that, what I'm going to do is hand this over to Damon, who's going to walk us through it. I'm also going to be giving you a bit of information about our panelists today for those of you who are unfamiliar with them. The first is Damon Hacker. Damon is our president, founder, and CEO of Vestige. He has 30 years of experience in cybersecurity, including a background in IT security and auditing. He graduated with an MBA and has an undergrad degree from Case Western Reserve University. He's a CMMC RP, registered practitioner, and Vestige as a company is a CMMC registered provider organization. We also have joining us today Danny Stempel. Danny is a cybersecurity analyst at Vestige. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in digital forensics. He works with clients on cybersecurity readiness, vulnerability scanning, external penetration testing, and compliance audits. We also have with us Dustin Mobley. Dustin is a cybersecurity analyst at Vestige. He is a certified CMMC professional, also known as a CCP. He has a BS in criminal justice, majoring in digital forensics and minoring in cybersecurity. He's currently working on a Master's of Information in Cybersecurity degree, an MICS, from the University of California, Berkeley, expected to graduate in April of 2025. Dustin also serves in the U.S. Navy he has served in the U.S. Navy for 5 years and continues to serve in the U.S. Navy Reserve. And we also have with us Evan Hausler. Evan is a cybersecurity specialist at Vestige. He too is a CMMC RP, or registered professional. He is currently working on a BS in cybersecurity, graduating at the end of this year. Nice job. And Evan assists our cybersecurity analysts in preparing client deliverables. He also helps us to maintain our internal documentation of assessments and our remediation engagements. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand this over to Damon, who's going to provide us with an overview of the rule. Thank you, Damon.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Jane. Thanks to everybody for joining this. It's so the purpose of this one really is to answer a lot of questions, that kind of stuff that you guys have. It's a small enough group that we're going to be able to do that. So feel free to put any questions in the chat, as well as I think I've got it set right. You can actually unmute yourself from there. But what we're going to do first is each of us are going to take and maybe go about 3 to 5 minutes on just a section that we picked out that we felt was important to kind of talk about in terms of what's going on with this. And so the topics that we're really looking to cover is just kind of bring you up to speed in terms of kind of our take on the rule. Not going to go into real in-depth here. We're going to hit that in the questions and answer section. We're going to talk about the timeline a little bit on that. Then one particular area we're going to want to focus in on is some of the language around outside IT. We'll call them external service providers, and some of the information that's around there, which affects a lot of small and mid-sized businesses from there, and then follow it up with getting started on that. So if you haven't been paying attention, the rule, the proposed rule we hit the Federal Register on December 26th, so a late Christmas present there for us from there. It's in its full glory. It's about 234 pages long as a PDF from there, and there's a lot of information in there. Don't expect people to read it. I did. We got a head start on it the weekend before, and actually was able to go through that from there. And here's the big thing. There really were no surprises. Nothing nothing really tangential or tangible on that. A couple of things. Actually, the biggest thing that I was a little surprised around was some of the representations that had been made around the Joint Surveillance Program. If you guys are familiar with it, that was a mechanism that companies could get started through their C3PAOs. Where DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, comes together and does a joint assessment of the organization. A couple of surprises around that in terms of what it takes to be compliant and the timing on that. But otherwise, pretty much everything that was in the rule when it went from CMMC version 1 to version 2, as it was released as a proposed rule back in November of 2021, found its light of day in the final, in the draft rule, the draft final rule that came out in the Federal Register on December 26th. If you did happen to have a chance to go through, or if you do pick it up and start looking through it, recognize out of those 234 pages, it's really only about the last 40 pages that are the rule itself. A lot of it was preamble to it. And there's a lot of repetition through that, partially because that was really designed to be for the consumption of the private industry and realistically the legislation, the legislatures from there. So a lot of the information is repeated in sections from there. But here's the big takeaway, the big thing that I felt in reading it probably was mentioned 5 to 8 times in there, depending on what you were looking at, is that the DoD's stance, and this is pretty consistent with what they've been saying, as well, but their stance on CMMC is that CMMC does not introduce any new cybersecurity requirements. That those requirements have been in contracts since 2016 under DFARS 252, 204, 7012. And then there's a couple of them that got added, in addition to that. But what we colloquially call NIST 800-171 has been around. Everybody knows what the requirements are. And, those in the defense industrial base should have already been pursuing those, if not already had them in place. And so CMMC doesn't introduce new requirements. What it merely does is create the verification that you're doing the things that you were already supposed to do over there. And I think that's a really important aspect of the rule, because a lot of people have doubted that it's going to happen. Right? Had conversations over the years, said, no, it's never going to happen. It's going to tie the hands of the DoD. They're not going to be able to get contracts done. This is just not going to happen. And I've said for a long time, it's already happened. The rule is already there in terms of what needs to be done. So clearly that's their kind of marching orders with that. It's merely the verification. Something else that I thought was interesting in terms of what was included in the preamble was that, if you remember, between when CMMC first was introduced, it was actually supposed to go into effect in July of 2020, right? COVID had other plans for it, ended up getting kicked down the road. There were some other issues and that kind of stuff with the way it was kind of being forced through. But in early 2021, as the Biden administration came on board, they did a top to bottom review of CMMC. And that included a public comment period. And during the course of that, they collected somewhere around 800, 850 comments from the public. And that is what actually drove CMMC version 2.0. And while on the surface, CMMC version 1.0 and 2.0 were pretty, there were some significant differences. For those of us that were kind of in the industry and really understood what was going on with 1.0 to 2.0, there really wasn't a lot of changes. Sure, it went from 5, levels down to 3, but as a good example, we already knew there wasn't going to be anything at level 2. And there was a high question whether there was going to be anything at level 4, right? So they basically collapsed that model. There were other things like that that got introduced in there. And again, that was all based upon these comments that came out. And for quite some time, I've been of the opinion that realistically, 2.0 was a tweaking of 1.0, which kind of told me they got it right the first time. I don't anticipate, based upon the comments that we've seen so far, that there's going to be any significant change between what's been proposed on December 26th until the actual final rule comes out on that. So just kind of keep that in mind as we walk through this. Happy to address other questions as that comes up, but I'm going to turn it over to Dustin, who's going to talk about the timeline, where we're at, and where we're going with that. There. So, Dustin.
Oh, thanks, Damon. Right. So really, with rulemaking, I kind of wanted to go over sort of the process with how the Department of Defense and really any federal agency goes about creating rules or proposing new ones, doing comment periods and whatnot. So whenever a federal agency, we're focusing on the DoD here, wants to create a rule that will affect private organizations or really another government agency or themselves, they have to basically propose a rule in most cases. Sometimes they can waive it, but there has to be a very specific reason as to why they're waiving it. But in this case, they're not waiving the proposed rule requirement. They are including a comment period, which they did for CMMC 1.0 when that proposed rule came about, and then they also did for CMMC 2.0, and then we're seeing it now with this proposed rule that was just released just a few months ago, back in December. So when it was released, the proposed rule back in December, it was followed by a comment period. There was about 60 days that you could go in and leave a comment if you had an opinion about it or if you wanted something addressed. And so they actually closed out the comment period. So you can't leave a comment anymore, but they are actively going through those comments, addressing them. And they're even posting some of them, not all of them, to the Federal Register. So you can actually check out what others are saying about the rule. And I encourage you to do that. But basically, so what's next? Now that the comment period's closed, what will be sort of the next step? Just so you all know, a subsequent proposed rule could be created. So we have a proposed rule now. And then it's not a immediate next step is a final rule. It could absolutely be a final rule, and we're all expecting a final rule. But depending on what was put in the comment period, or what was put as comments during that comment period, could definitely affect that outcome, and we could potentially see another proposed rule. I highly doubt that'll happen, but just know our next step is either a final rule or it's going to be another proposed rule. So for the timeline, really what I felt is most important to share with you all is that you're all probably wondering, what is the timeline of this whole thing? Is there any dates given? What should I be expecting here with this proposed rule? Realistically, there is no actual definitive date in the proposed rule outside of one of the comments basically asked for a date. And the DoD responded with that the Department of Defense intends on having all phases of this process rolled out by October 1st, 2026. So that is just a couple years and a few months away. So what I wanted to do is kind of pose a hypothetical. So what if the final rule dropped tomorrow? So it's the 12th today. What if it dropped on 3/13? So phase 1 would essentially start April 13th. It's between 30 and 60 days that phase 1 would start. So what does phase 1 consist of? Basically a level 1 and a level 2 self-assessment would be required during that phase 1. But what's interesting is that the DoD project managers, they actually have discretion to either include a certification assessment. So that's actually getting your environment verified against the level 2 CMMC practices. They have the discretion to include that in new contracts, but they also can modify current contracts. And they could say, you know what, we need you to have your certification here in the next 3 months or 6 months or 90 days. They have full discretion to do that. Then phase 2, we would be looking at about 6 months after phase 1 starts. So that would be October 13th in our hypothetical timeline here. The level 2 certification requirement would be for all new contracts. So it's not just a level 1 or 2 self-assessment. It would be, you have to have a level 2 certification. So you would have to have, you would have to meet with the C3PO. They would need to give you a certification that you've passed it just 6 months after the start of phase 1. So this thing drops tomorrow, final rules out, phase 1 started in April, then you would basically have from April until October 13th to get your environment assessed and receive that level 2 certification. And again, they have the discretion to modify current contracts that are in place already. So continuing with our little proposed timeline here, phase 3, that would start a year after phase 2 starts. So hypothetically, October 13th, 2025. And it's very clear, basically level 2 or level 3 certification would be required as condition for contract award. So the difference between what's here and what's in phase 2 is that essentially they could create it as a condition of award in phase 2 to have that certification assessment completed. But you would, it may not be immediate, right? They could say you need to have the certification completed within 90 days, whereas this phase 3 starts and it's, you will not get this contract until you demonstrate that you have the certification in hand. You've already went through it. And that's the only way that you can really get the certification. And then there's still a little bit of discretion. It's very limited. Nothing significant though. So basically, as soon as phase 3 hits, if you want to get a contract, you would need to have that certification assessment completed. And then phase 4, that's October 13th, 2026. So in this hypothetical timeline, we're actually a little bit past what the DoD outrightly they said directly in the proposed rule by saying that they wanted all 4 phases completed by October 1st, 2026. So there's no discretion at that point. It would just be if you want, a level 2, or if you want a contract that requires you to have a level 2 assessment completed, then you would need that certification in hand. And I'm going to pass it over to Evan.
Great, thank you, Dustin. So with this one here, we were going to kind of go over the terms for what Damon initially said in this proposed rule. There was a lot of talk around the MSPs, the MSSPs, any kind of external service provider. It was one of the largest areas with comments from the proposed rule that dropped back in December. And I just kind of wanted to give a brief overview of what exactly each of them are. So an MSP would be your managed service provider. ESP would be your external service provider. So that's anybody that would be, like an outsourced IT that would assist you with any kind of configurations or, on-hand support. And then the MSSP would be your managed security provider. And they would be doing things like ensuring that your network is like monitoring and making sure that everything is staying secure within your environment. And then next up was the public comments. So what level do the external service providers need to be? So what it says in there is essentially whatever certification level that your organization is going for, your MSP or external service provider needs to be at that same level or higher. And that was what was in the proposed rule. So, it could change theoretically, but like Dustin was saying earlier, chances are that, the final rule will be dropped before another proposed. Now, when it comes to the CSPs, the cloud service providers, they do not have to have a CMMC certification. They do need to be FedRAMP moderate or higher. That is the only thing that it said in the proposed rule regarding cloud service providers. That's anybody that's doing cloud storage, cloud backups, things like that. So when will this be required? Like Dustin was saying, phase 3 is when it will start being into the contracts. But inside the proposed rule, phase 4 is referred to as the full implementation. So there'd be no discretion on it. It would be a requirement. It does trickle down. So before your organization to be CMMC certified, your MSP would need to be that way. You could then comply with all 110 of the controls as well. And the anticipation is that it would start, or the final rule would drop at the start of the new government fiscal year, which would be October 1st. And with that, I will hand it over to Danny.
Thank you. All right. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the getting started phase. So on the next slide here, the first point I wanted to make is that CMMC is definitely happening. Given that everyone here is probably here because of CMMC, this probably doesn't apply to you necessarily, but as Damon mentioned earlier, we've had some people say that they just don't think the CMMC requirements will ever actually be required. We know that's not true, so it's good to be working on this process now. If you haven't already started, you should get started soon. Which brings us to our next point. The entire process takes 9 to 12 months. Now, an important detail on this one is that the 9 to 12 months includes a sort of like burn-in period for all of the controls that have been implemented. This means that the first 6-9 months should be spent getting everything in place. And then a few months should be spent making sure that everything is working correctly and documenting everything and building up evidence for the assessor to look at. Now, if you're just getting started, one of the most important things to do is to make sure that you have a plan in place. We've seen a lot of organizations that are eager to get things started or to boost their score and try to tackle the easy requirements, the low-hanging fruit first. Unfortunately, this often causes problems because as they move on from the easy controls and start working on some of the more difficult ones, they find that the things that they've already put in place for those easy controls, those things have to be changed or modified or updated. It's a little like when you were back in school and the teacher told you to read the entire test before starting it. Without an overall understanding of all of the controls, it's difficult to make sure that nothing is overlooked or that something isn't being implemented incorrectly. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about on the next slide is how companies can get stuck with their remediation process. Some of the common pitfalls that we've seen organizations run into. The first one is bad prioritization. Like I mentioned a minute ago, not having a plan going into this will result in a lot of time and money being spent without much to show for it. The control requirements as a whole have to be understood, and once they are, a plan should be created that defines clear priorities for which controls will be addressed first. The next big pitfall we see is when an organization takes a hands-off approach. One of the most common versions of this is when management decides that they need to get CMMC certified, then just tells the IT person or IT team to just get it done. This approach doesn't work for a few different reasons, but a big one is that not all of the controls are technical. Many of them are, and those can maybe be handled by an IT team, but a lot of them have more to do with HR or management than they do IT. Even the more technical controls often require things like purchasing decisions that management has to be involved in anyway. Next, we see a lot of controls being misinterpreted. Some of the controls are pretty straightforward. For example, one of the controls say that the organization must prohibit the use of portable storage devices when those devices have no identifiable owner. That's pretty easy. If you see something like a flash drive just laying around and you don't know who it belongs to, don't plug it in. Some controls are a little more vague, like the one that requires you to provide protection from malicious code at appropriate locations within organizational information systems. That one is a little more complicated, more prone to misinterpretation, like what qualifies as protection from malicious code, what exactly is an appropriate location. Not understanding what each of these controls actually requires causes a lot of companies to just spin their wheels, not really get anywhere. The last one I want to mention is companies underestimating what it actually takes to become compliant. We've had a lot of organizations come to us with a self-assessment that they performed that shows a pretty decent score. And then when we go through our own assessment of the environment, the score that we come up with is often lower than the self-assessment. This sometimes means that they didn't fully understand the control requirements and actually have more work ahead of them than they initially thought. Part of this problem is that most controls actually have more than one control objective. Some of them have as many as 6 or 8 sub-objectives that have to be met before the control is considered satisfied. So having an accurate idea of where your organization is currently and a realistic plan of how to move forward will go a long way in avoiding this particular hurdle and keep the remediation process as a whole moving along. And with that, I'll pass things back over to Damon.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So again, the idea on that one was really just to kind of give a brief overview of things. I mean, the rule, like I said, there weren't really many changes to it, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of questions and a lot of things, to kind of explore. So we're hoping this is going to be kind of more of a, iterative process, and you ask questions, that kind of stuff. Again, feel free to put things in the chat and or unmute yourself in that. But we do have some. I figured I would start with some of the questions, that were provided. I'm gonna just read it and see anybody on the panel. Feel free to chime in on that one. Also, I'm gonna go back on a couple of things that we talked about. To just maybe get a little bit more clarification on that. Again, anybody can kind of speak up on this one. Evan, during the comment, you talked about the MSPs, and generically they're called ESPs, right? So you've got CSPs, MSPs, and MSSPs. There was a bullet point there that asked about how do you know if they need to be certified, on that. And I don't know if anybody's got, I will say this is one of those ones, as Evan said, that there's a lot of questions around the public comment period, a lot of questions around asking for more specificity around that. But anybody have some ideas in terms of what really qualifies an MSP particularly, but even the MSSPs and that kind of stuff, as to whether they're going to need to have the certification?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to the CMMC certification, if the MSP would be required to have that certification in the case that they were to handle any kind of CUI or security protection data, which would be things like log data, configuration data, and things of that nature. If the MSP has to process, store, or transmit that information in any kind of way on their own assets, then they would be considered an MSP that would need a certification.
Okay. Yeah. So meaning that and actually, I think that's a really interesting way that's been proposed. And of course, we're all expecting or hoping that we're going to get some further clarification from the DoD on it. But from what I have seen so far, it really mimics what you just said there, which is if you're taking possession of or storing, transferring CUI. I like that answer from the standpoint that a lot of times we are asked questions, not even just about the MSP world, but in general about the scope of where these controls, where these practices need to be applied. And one of the things that I always kind of reiterate to people is think about what the objective from the DoD is with NIST 800-171 and CMMC. It is to create a culture of cybersecurity around protecting the CUI, right? So if you think about that, as you're planning your scope, where you need to apply these practices, if you think about how CUI plays in your environment, right? How do you receive it? How do you use it? How does it get transferred within the organization, and how does it get transferred out of the organization? And or are you creating, CUI that you're sending out there? if you think through that process and really look at what it is that CUI touches, right? How does it get transmitted? How does it get stored? And where does it get used? That can answer a lot of the questions around the scope. So taking, Evan, your example there, an MSP who, theoretically has the keys to the kingdom and can see and get into the environment and that kind of stuff, if they're not taking possession of that CUI, they're not, storing it and that kind of stuff, then it would stand to reason that they don't need to be certified. But if that MSP is providing services where they're storing it, say, like in a private cloud under their control, or it's a data center co-located, and they've got, MSP actually has the equipment and it's co-located in a data center, I would say at that point in time, and see if anybody else disagrees with me, but if that point in time you would, because you're taking possession of it and storing it, you'd have to be certified. That seemed to be within reason.
Yeah, definitely I think the CUI part is fairly straightforward. As long as your MSP isn't directly handling that CUI, then it wouldn't make sense for them to carry that same level of certification as your organization, because they're not dealing with the same sensitive information, right? But I just think that the most interesting part, and really the part that begs to be further explained and add more detail, is the security protection data aspect of it. And a lot of comments that I've seen, at least pertaining to that part, the security protection data, they're not in favor of it, obviously, because if you think about it, treating security protection data as CUI brings a lot more into scope, at least for MSPs. It doesn't say that you need to treat your security protection data that you have in your organization as CUI, but it does state that these external service providers who are handling that information need to be the same level of certification. And I personally kind of wrestled with that for a while, because I couldn't really understand, this whole CMMC is supposed to be about the, demonstrating control of CUI. So if the MSP or the external service provider isn't handling the CUI, why would it make sense for them to be the same certification level? But then if you kind of really think about it, these MSPs have things like configuration data, they have network diagrams, they have a total inventory of the systems that you have in place, and what patches are put out, how often things are updated, and VPNs that are in use. Basically, a ton of information that would be absolutely fantastic for an adversary to have if they wanted to compromise a contractor of interest. So if you are an organization that is in possession of CUI, it might be very difficult for you to, find information that would lead to a compromise of that environment. But if you were to target the MSP or the external service provider, and get that security protection data that may not right off the bat seem like it would be useful, it would absolutely be useful to an adversary. So I think that's kind of why it included that whole security protection data bit in addition to the CUI, at least for the external service provider. Ultimately, we'll see. Like I said before, a lot of the comments are they're not happy about it. A lot of MSPs are not ready to be assessed against CMMC level 2. But realistically, I don't think our national security is getting any less of a concern. I think that if anything, it's increasing. The threat is increasing, at least, and for that reason, you're going to see a lot more things like MSPs requiring certification, or maybe even higher levels of supply chain risk management. All those things are coming together, and I think that it most likely will not back down from that. If anything, it might increase. So obviously, it's not definitive. This is just in the proposed rule that the security protection data would warrant that an external service provider be included in scope, or at least needed that level 2 certification. But it's just definitely something to keep on your radar and be aware of. So thank you, Evan, for bringing that up as well.
Cool. So one of the questions that was posed prior to this as well was, are there any reciprocal certifications, right? So I know a lot of times we will talk with companies and they've already explored or maybe even have, something in place with like ISO 27001, something along that lines, which again is a cybersecurity framework. What does CMMC say about that? Anybody? Unfortunately, nothing, right? So I know what it's something that we get asked, pretty frequently. And as it stands right now, there is no reciprocity between any of the different frameworks that are out there. That's even inclusive of the fact if somebody has a facility, a rated facility, and they've got a facility clearance from there where they're able to handle secret and top secret information, right? When we're talking about controlled unclassified information, if I'm able to handle secret and top secret in my environment, why the heck do I need to go through CMMC, again? And I think the position on the DoD has been one of, yeah, we know that's out there and we're going to consider that down the road. But right now we are focused on just getting the rule in place and getting things squared away on that side. We will look to implement that later, down the road from there. The other part to this, and this kind of goes in hand with another question that was asked about joint ventures from there, but you have to be really careful in terms of what the environment, the scoped environment is, right? So theoretically, you could have an organization that does have a facility clearance and does have that ability to use, secret and top secret, information. But if their environment for CMMC is different, then kind of all the, everything you've done for that is moot, right? So you've got to have all these controls around that same environment, which leads to the question about the joint venture is who needs to be compliant, right? So two companies coming together with a joint venture, which company needs to be compliant? The answer, it's a lovely lawyer answer, right? It depends. It depends on where the CUI is, right? And how is it being transmitted? How is it being used? And where is it being stored? Technically speaking, every entity with a cage code has to be assessed if it's using CUI. So the joint venture, which would have its own cage code, would be the entity at which it's being certified. But what if you have a situation where one company is bringing, maybe the financing or the intellectual property or the labor to the table, but the other one is the technology and has all the CUI? Pretty straightforward, in our opinion, that it would be, you'd have to get the joint venture certified, but where the environment would be in the one side of the joint venture. And again, it's the importance of the scoping becomes really, really important. The next presentation we're going to do on this, we're going to focus a lot on the scoping part of it. But if one of you guys would kind of talk a little bit about that piece, the scoping, why it's so important, that would be, kind of good.
Sure thing. So I can take it over. Scoping is definitely my specialty. I know a ton about it. Basically, when it comes to CMMC, a lot of people think that they can just essentially say everything's in scope in their environment. They can say that, I have CUI kind of all over the place and everybody touches it. And so my scope is just my whole company or something like that, which, may be true. You may have CUI kind of all over the place and maybe everybody even touches it. But the truth is that just saying, everything's in scope is just not an appropriate answer to the what's in scope question. If everything is in scope, then you basically need to break down exactly what is in scope and why it's in scope. And the way that you start to determine specifically what sort of assets are involved in the scoping process is to, like Damon has said many times, just start with where the CUI exists. If you're trying to determine which personnel and which computers are going to need to meet all 110 controls. You just need to figure out which of those things the CUI touches. There are several different categories of assets as far as CMMC is concerned. So another big piece of why you can't just say everything's in scope is because there are going to be certain assets that are not CUI assets, but maybe they have to meet all of the controls. So an example of that is like a security protection asset. And those two things, the CUI asset and the security protection asset, both require compliance with all 110 controls, the applicable ones at least. And an asset can be, it can be a laptop, it can be a mobile phone, it can be even a person, it can be a locking filing cabinet, it can be an office space, it can be an entire building. So any of those things really can be an asset. And for CUI assets, the specification is it's anything that stores, processes, or transmits CUI, where the security protection asset, which also has to meet all the same requirements as a CUI asset, it's basically anything that satisfies a control. So, there's a requirement to use a VPN when you're remotely accessing an environment, right? So that VPN would basically be a security protection asset. It's the thing that is allowing your organization to be compliant when it's remotely accessing a network. However, the security protection asset, while it does need to meet all 110 controls, it actually doesn't need to process CUI or store it or transmit it at all. So you might have things in your environment that have nothing to do with CUI, but they still are involved with CMMC and meeting the practices. And so those assets need to meet all 110 controls. And there's a couple other asset categories. There's specialized assets, which don't actually have to meet 110 controls of CMMC. And then there's what's called a contractor risk managed asset. These things we'll get into, I'm sure, in our next presentation. But just know that realistically, it's critical. It's the very first step in kind of getting everything under control, is to scope out your environment, see where the CUI flows, and then you determine so you have the CUI assets, where CUI resides and touches and what things are involved in that process, but then figuring out what other categories of assets you might have in your environment. And then you just go from there. That the CUI assets have to meet X number of controls, and that the security protection assets have to meet those controls. And so, when you're going down the list and figuring out, which controls need to be applied to what assets, you already know based on the scoping activities that you performed.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So, okay, so I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions that you guys that are online have from there. So again, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself, and we'll pause for a few minutes and then see if there's any. Not seeing anybody unmute themselves. Oh, there's one in the chat, so perfect. Let's see. My understanding is that as it currently stands, CMMC will be assessing against NIST 800-171 Rev 2. However, Rev 3 has been drafted. How does that play in or change anything? Perfect question on that one. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't know why it wouldn't let you unmute, but yeah. Any thoughts on that, panel? So here's what the official stance is so far from the accreditation body. And specifically, it's coming from, so the accreditation body, right, holds an exclusive contract with the DoD, and they were charged with doing two things. One was creating the certification, and the second was creating the ecosystem to support that, right? So the C3PAOs is part of it. RPOs like ourselves are part of that. The publishers and training facilities that train things like RPs, CCPs, the assessors, that kind of stuff, those are all part of the ecosystem. You are 100% right. Rev 3 is in draft mode right now. That's not uncommon, right? These frameworks change from time to time. And the idea, and I think a big part of the change between CMMC version 1 and version 2 was that the DoD actually dropped the additional controls that they had originally proposed in version 1, specifically to align it with NIST 800-171, whatever revision it's in at that point in time. The language in the rule is very unclear as to what version it's asking for. Right now, it actually is written in such a way that says it's Rev 2. And if it goes in that way, theoretically, it would be Rev 2, and it would always be Rev 2. Yet, in the rule, there's other places where they referenced whatever the reference model was and said its current version. I fully expect that when the rule comes out, after these comments are adjudicated, that instead of saying that it's CMMC or that it's NIST 800-171 Rev 2, it's probably going to say NIST 800-171 in its current version within X amount of time, right? I know from talking with the component of the accreditation body that is responsible for the certification, right? The certification of the assessors, the RPs, the CCPs, and that kind of stuff, that it is going to take a while for that new version to work its way through the CMMC ecosystem. If Rev 3 was adopted today, the estimate is that it's already going to take about 1.5 years or more for it to be adopted and become commonplace as part of CMMC. Okay, so if we think about that, Rev 3 is still in the draft mode. Once it's accepted, then and I fully expect that it's going to be, Rev 3 is going to be put into place before CMMC as a rule goes into effect. But I do still think, again, based on what the CAICO, the part of the CMMC accreditation body, is saying, that it's going to take about 1.5 years or longer before it comes into into that. Okay. And how did you do that? Okay, let's see about that. Dustin, are you able to? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I muted myself and then I went to go unmute myself and it told me I couldn't. So thank you for getting that taken care of.
All right, cool. I just did ask other people to unmute if they want to from there. So any other questions? Did that answer your question there, Vincent? Yeah, perfect. Okay. Yeah, it's a great question because it's definitely asked many times. So any other questions? So, and feel free to jump in again. If from there I'll go back to a couple other ones that have been asked on there. So one of the other things that we tend to get questions on, and it impacts this a little bit based on that rollout schedule that you presented, Destin, there. Level 2 contracts. We have prioritized and non-prioritized contracts, right? In some sense, I wish we didn't add yet another layer of complexity, or not necessarily complexity, but unknown into the whole process. But the DoD did that, right? And so there's these level 1 and there's level 2 non-prioritized and level 2 prioritized. I noticed they didn't call it that in the rule, but up until that, they'd always referred to it as prioritized and non-prioritized. Now they're calling them, assessment required ones and certification required, which is basically the same thing. I have a little bit of insight into what that means, but have you guys seen any kind of guidance and that kind of stuff in terms of what's a prioritized, what's a non-prioritized product, and why did the DoD introduce this, this confusion into it? Anything?
So, as far as level 2 self-assessment and level 2 certification assessment goes, I haven't really seen, what's going to be what's going to make a level 2, self-assessment a self-assessment, and what's going to make a certification assessment a certification assessment. But what I have seen is that for level 3 contracts, at least, It will be essentially, if you go to get a contract, the contract will state that this is a level 3 contract. In order to win this contract, you basically have to meet CMMC level 3 controls, or the certification requirement. So I'm assuming that we can't really tell for right now which contracts at the level 2 are going to require a self-assessment or a certification assessment. But if it's anything like they've talked about with level 3, then I would assume that it would just be right there up front. You would see when you go to bid on the contract, it'll state that this will require a self-assessment, or this will require a certification assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The only thing I've seen on that has been the reasoning they put it in place was to give the DoD the flexibility to ramp up things if they so needed to, right? And so if there was a contract that was hanging out there, non-critical, right? It's part of the uniform, right? Somebody's, doing the boots for the uniform, or, something like that. It's not mission critical. It's something that's there. That's probably going to be a non-prioritized contract, so that the DoD can still get that contract through the supply chain without necessarily having to have the C3PAO assessment, on that side of things. So that's about the biggest thing I've seen. I probably have time for one last one, kind of a discussion, and then we'll end it there. Is so we get asked a lot about Office 365, right? Some people out there know and recognize that there's multiple versions of Office 365, that there's the commercial version, which is what most people are on, but then there's GCC or the Government Community Cloud, GCC High, Government Community Cloud High. What's the differences? Why do we have to worry about that? Any thoughts on that? And it was addressed slightly in the rule, but no, not tremendously.
Right. So from what I know from the Office 365 suite is that the E3 commercial is not allowed, or it's not considered compliant, because the Microsoft cannot ensure that data is stored here in the U.S. But when you move up to GCC, then it says that they can ensure that any kind of data that you store in the cloud will be, on servers here in America. But that's all I've seen in terms of that.
Yeah, which interestingly enough isn't part of the rule, but is actually part of FAR, right? It's not part of CMMC rule, but it's part of FAR, which is that data, CUI has to be stored, in the US, data residency in the US from there. GCC High then also introduces the concept of data sovereignty, meaning that the individuals who are administering the tenant are US nationals, right? US citizens, and not foreign nationals, which makes sense, I guess, when you look at it, because for level 3, you're talking about CUI specified, and some of the CUI specified carries with it limited dissemination, requirements, like the no foreign nationals from there. So yeah, that's kind of what I've seen from there. There's some interesting solutions out there that don't necessarily require a company to go to GCC or GCC High by implementing other controls around that to facilitate that. But yeah, that would be something that we kind of take a look at, for individual companies' requirements and that. So. All right. Well, yeah, that's I think we're kind of at the end of that. I don't see it. Oh, there was another question that came up. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah. So, and then so Vincent had said, definitely appreciate that info regarding Office. It's a major issue internally. It gets complex, especially the more people you've got, because there's an increased cost in going to GCC or GCC High, but there's also the licensing, right? And of course, you got the migration and that kind of stuff too. But the bigger piece is, how do you how do you function within the organization, especially if you're you know, a complex organization and you're only doing a small part of your work in the DoD space, and the rest of it is based on you know, non-DoD. You know, do you put everything in that quote unquote enclave? And especially at GCC high, collaborating with people who are not GCC high becomes more challenging. We'll just put it that way, because of some of the controls and that kind of stuff that are there. So yeah, definitely something to look at. So. All right, well, with that, I'll go ahead and end it with one final kind of comments on it. Right, CMMC is here. We know that it's going to be from there. You know, definitely have to have it in place, as opposed to NIST 800-171, which is, you know, you got to be working on it. You got to have the stuff in place with NIST for CMMC from there. So no doubt in my mind that the DoD is serious about the cybersecurity, and that's really kind of you know, shown by a couple of different things, right? The spot audits that they've been conducting over the last couple of years. You know, interesting. I have no idea if this timing was actually coincidental or if it was hand in hand with it, but so CMMC 2.0, the rule was introduced in November of 2021, right? On October 6th of 2021, the DOJ came out with the enforcement letter, which basically stated that they were going to increase enforcement of companies that take money from the government, whether it's through grants or through contracts and that kind of stuff. They were going to increase the enforcement around the representations that those companies make about their cybersecurity, as well as the failure to report incidents. And they're doing that under the False Claims Act. And so just another, evidence that it's being, taken seriously. And then when you look at the rule itself, and the majority of the thing was the preamble to it, and it was really stating things like, this doesn't introduce any new requirements other than the verification. You can really kind of see that the DoD is, really serious about the security from there. And if you do it the right way, it doesn't have to be overly costly and that. So with that, I appreciate you guys coming on board. There's our contact information, of course, and if you've had any follow-up questions and that kind of stuff, happy to entertain those. So, Jane, anything you want to end with? And I'll ask you to unmute in case you can't do that.
Yes, the one thing I wanted to say is that we are doing the second session. It's going to be on Thursday, which is March 14th. It's at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we are going to be talking about scope and execution. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.